Sometimes love finds us when we least expect it, in the darkest corners of our existence where we've convinced ourselves we don't deserve happiness. This is the story of Emma, a woman who carried invisible wounds that ran deeper than any physical scar, and David, a man who saw beauty in broken things. It's about the moment when someone looks past your flaws and chooses to love not despite your scars, but because they're part of what makes you uniquely you. In a world that often teaches us to hide our pain, this is a story about finding someone who makes you want to heal, not to become worthy of love, but to realize you always were. Emma pulled her sleeves down over her wrists as she pushed open the heavy glass door of the small coffee shop. The familiar chime announced her arrival, and she felt the usual flutter of anxiety in her stomach. This had become her routine over the past 3 months, arriving at precisely 2:30 p.m. when the afternoon rush had died down, ordering the same medium coffee with extra cream, and settling into the corner table where she could watch the world go by while remaining largely invisible. The barista, a young woman with bright pink hair, smiled warmly as Emma approached the counter. "The usual?" she asked, already reaching for a cup. Emma nodded, offering a small smile in return. She appreciated that the staff here had learned not to make small talk. They seemed to understand that some customers came here not for social interaction, but for the comfort of being around people without having to engage. The gentle hum of conversation, the soft jazz playing in the background, and the rich aroma of coffee beans created a cocoon of normalcy that Emma desperately needed. As she waited for her order, Emma's eyes wandered around the familiar space. The coffee shop was exactly what one might expect from a place called the Reading Nook. Mismatched furniture, walls lined with well-worn books, and soft lighting that made everyone look slightly more attractive than they probably were. It was the kind of place where graduate students spent entire afternoons working on their theses, where first dates happened over nervous laughter, and where people like Emma could disappear into the background. "Medium coffee with extra cream," the barista called out, setting the cup on the counter with a small smile. Emma thanked her and made her way to her usual table, carefully balancing her coffee and the worn paperback she'd been reading for weeks. She'd read the same page multiple times, not because the story was particularly complex, but because her mind often wandered to places she'd rather not visit. Reading had become less about escape and more about having something to focus on when the memories threatened to surface. She was settling into her chair when she noticed him. David was sitting 2 tables away, a laptop open in front of him, but his attention was focused on a sketchbook. His dark hair was slightly messy, as if he'd been running his hands through it while working, and he wore a simple gray sweater that had seen better days. There was something about his posture, relaxed but focused, that caught Emma's attention. Most people in coffee shops seemed either frantically busy or deliberately casual. He appeared genuinely absorbed in whatever he was creating. Emma tried to return her attention to her book, but she found herself glancing over at him periodically. She watched as his hand moved across the paper with confident strokes, pausing occasionally to study his work before continuing. There was something peaceful about watching someone completely immersed in their craft, and Emma felt some of her own tension begin to ease. She had been coming to this coffee shop for months, and while she'd seen many of the same faces repeatedly, she'd never noticed him before. Perhaps he was new to the area, or maybe he usually came at different times. Emma had become expert at cataloging the regular customers, the businessman who always ordered a double espresso and made loud phone calls, the elderly woman who spent hours working on crossword puzzles, the young mother who brought her toddler for what appeared to be their daily outing. When David looked up from his sketchbook, their eyes met for just a moment. Emma felt her cheeks warm and quickly looked down at her book, pretending to read. She could feel her heart beating a little faster, and she silently scolded herself for the reaction. She wasn't ready for even casual social interaction with strangers, let alone anything that might be construed as flirtation. But when she risked another glance a few minutes later, she found that David had returned to his sketching, seemingly unaffected by their brief eye contact. This should have been a relief, but Emma found herself feeling slightly disappointed. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her with anything other than pity or concern. The fleeting moment of normal human connection, Even just eye contact with a stranger had felt surprisingly good. Emma tried to focus on her reading, but the words seemed to blur together on the page. Instead, she found herself thinking about her sister Rachel's constant encouragement to put herself out there. Rachel meant well, but she didn't understand that Emma wasn't ready. The therapy was helping, slowly, but there were still days when getting dressed and leaving her apartment felt like a monumental achievement. Coming to the coffee shop was progress, even if Rachel didn't see it that way. The sound of a chair scraping against the floor drew Emma's attention back to the present. David was packing up his things, carefully placing his sketchbook in a worn leather messenger bag. As he stood, he glanced in her direction again, and this time he smiled. It wasn't a flirtatious smile, or even particularly meaningful, just the kind of polite acknowledgement that strangers sometimes share in public spaces. But something about the warmth in his expression made Emma's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Before she could decide whether to smile back, he had turned and was walking toward the exit. Emma watched him leave, noting the way he held the door for an elderly man entering the shop, the patient way he waited for a woman with a stroller to maneuver through the narrow doorway. These small acts of courtesy seemed natural to him, not performed for show, but simply part of who he was. When the door closed behind him, Emma realized she had been holding her breath. She exhaled slowly and looked down at her coffee, which had grown cold while she'd been distracted. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the window had shifted, and she noticed that most of the other customers had left while she'd been lost in thought. For the first time in months, Emma found herself curious about someone other than herself. Who was he? What had he been drawing so intently? Was he an artist, a student, someone who sketched as a hobby? The questions felt strange after so many weeks of mental silence, of focusing only on getting through each day without falling apart. Emma finished her cold coffee and gathered her things. As she prepared to leave, she realized that she was already looking forward to tomorrow afternoon. Maybe he would be here again. Maybe they would make eye contact again. Maybe, eventually, she might even find the courage to smile back. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. Walking home through the quiet streets of her neighborhood, Emma found herself paying more attention to her surroundings than she had in weeks. She noticed the way the autumn light filtered through the changing leaves, the sound of children playing in a nearby park, the elderly couple walking hand in hand down the sidewalk. It was as if her brief interaction with David, if it could even be called an interaction, had awakened something in her that had been dormant for too long. Back in her small apartment, Emma stood in front of her bathroom mirror and really looked at herself for the first time in months. The woman staring back at her was thin, pale, with dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer seemed to hide. Her brown hair, once her pride and joy, hung limp and lifeless around her shoulders. But, as she studied her reflection, she tried to see herself through a stranger's eyes. Through his eyes, what had he seen when he looked at her? Just another coffee shop customer? Someone who looked as lost and broken as she felt? Or had he seen something else, something she couldn't see in herself? Emma pulled her sleeves up slightly, exposing the thin scars that crisscrossed her forearms. The physical evidence of her darkest period, when the emotional pain had become too much to bear and she'd sought relief in the only way that had made sense at the time. The scars had faded from angry red to pale silver, but they were still visible, still a reminder of how close she'd come to giving up entirely. She traced one of the longer scars with her finger, remembering the night she'd made it. The overwhelming despair, the feeling that she would never be whole again, that she would never be worthy of love or happiness or any of the things that seemed to come so easily to other people. It had been Rachel who found her, Rachel who had stayed with her through the long nights in the hospital, Rachel who had helped her find the therapist who was slowly helping her piece herself back together. Emma pulled her sleeves down and turned away from the mirror. She wasn't ready to think about the scars yet, wasn't ready to imagine explaining them to someone else. But, for the first time since she'd started her healing journey, the idea didn't seem completely impossible. Maybe someday, with enough time and therapy and small steps forward, she might be able to let someone see all of her, scars and all. That night, Emma fell asleep thinking about kind eyes and gentle smiles, about the way someone could make you feel seen without saying a word. She dreamed of sketch pads and coffee shops and the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as invisible as she thought. Emma arrived at the coffee shop the next afternoon 15 minutes earlier than usual, though she told herself it was simply because she'd finished her morning therapy session ahead of schedule. Dr. Martinez had noticed a subtle change in her demeanor, commenting that Emma seemed more present, more engaged in their conversation than she'd been in previous sessions. Sometimes the smallest human connections can remind us that we're still capable of feeling, Dr. Martinez had said, her knowing eyes suggesting she understood more about Emma's improved mood than Emma had revealed. Don't be afraid to explore these feelings, even if they make you uncomfortable. Now, sitting in the coffee shop with her usual order and a fresh cup of hope, Emma tried not to watch the door too obviously. She'd chosen a book she could actually focus on, a collection of short stories that didn't require her to remember complex plot lines from day to day. Every few minutes, she'd glance up casually, scanning the shop as if she were simply people watching. By 3:15, she had begun to accept that David might not come in today. Perhaps he wasn't a regular customer after all. Perhaps yesterday had been a one-time visit, and she was foolish to have built any expectations around a stranger's schedule. The disappointment surprised her with its intensity. She hadn't realized how much she'd been looking forward to seeing him again until faced with the possibility that she wouldn't. Then, the door chimed, and there he was. David entered with the same quiet confidence she remembered from the day before, but today he looked slightly frazzled. His hair was more disheveled, and he carried his messenger bag as if it were heavier than usual. Emma watched as he approached the counter, noting the way he smiled at the barista despite whatever was clearly bothering him. Large coffee, black, and maybe something with enough sugar to help me survive the rest of this day, she heard him say, his voice carrying a hint of exhaustion mixed with self-deprecating humor. The barista laughed and recommended their chocolate croissant, which David accepted with grateful enthusiasm. Emma found herself smiling at the exchange, charmed by his easy rapport with the staff and his willingness to admit he was having a rough day. When David turned from the counter, his eyes swept the coffee shop and landed on Emma. This time, instead of looking away immediately, she held his gaze for a moment longer. Something passed between them, not quite recognition, but acknowledgement. He smiled, the same warm expression from the day before, but now it seemed more intentional, more directed specifically at her. To Emma's surprise, David began walking in her direction. Her heart rate quickened, and she felt the familiar urge to flee, but she forced herself to stay seated. He stopped beside her table, and she noticed his eyes were green with small flecks of gold that became visible in the afternoon sunlight. "I hope you don't mind me asking," he said, his voice gentle and respectful. "But is that the new Alice Munro collection? I've been meaning to pick up a copy, but I haven't had a chance to get to the bookstore." Emma looked down at her book, surprised that he'd noticed what she was reading from across the shop. "Yes, it is," she managed, her voice slightly hoarse from lack of use. "It's really good. Her writing is peaceful, I guess, if that makes sense." David's smile widened. "It makes perfect sense. Sometimes you need stories that don't demand too much from you emotionally. May I?" He gestured to the empty chair across from her. Emma hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. This was more human interaction than she'd had with a stranger in months. But something about David's demeanor put her at ease. He didn't seem to expect anything from her beyond casual conversation. "I'm David," he said as he settled into the chair, careful not to crowd her space. "Emma," she replied, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I've seen you here before," David continued, taking a sip of his coffee. "You always sit at this table. I was starting to think it might be reserved." His tone was light, teasing without being pushy. Emma felt her cheeks warm. "I'm a creature of habit, I suppose. This spot has good light for reading, and it's quiet. And it gives you a clear view of the door," David observed, but not in a way that made Emma feel exposed or judged. "I do the same thing. Always need to know what's happening around me." This admission surprised Emma. David seemed so confident, so at ease in the world. The idea that he might share some of her need for control and awareness made him seem more approachable, more human. "What do you do?" Emma asked, genuinely curious. "I noticed you were sketching yesterday." David's expression brightened. I'm a graphic designer, officially, but I sketch for my own sanity. There's something about putting pencil to paper that helps me think through problems, whether they're work-related or just life in general. Can I ask what you were drawing yesterday? The question slipped out before Emma could stop herself, and she immediately felt embarrassed by her boldness. But David didn't seem to mind. Actually, I was trying to capture the feeling of this place. The way the light comes through those windows, the way people seem to relax when they sit down. It's hard to draw atmosphere, but that's what I was attempting. Emma looked around the coffee shop with new eyes, trying to see it from an artist's perspective. Did you succeed? I'm not sure yet. Sometimes I have to let a drawing sit for a while before I know if it captures what I was trying to express. David paused, seeming to consider something. What about you? What do you do when you're not reading Alice Munro in coffee shops? The question Emma had been dreading. She'd been unemployed for 6 months, since her breakdown had made it impossible to continue her job as a social worker. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent years helping other people navigate their trauma while completely ignoring her own. I'm between jobs right now, she said carefully, taking some time to figure out what comes next. David nodded as if this were perfectly reasonable. Sometimes we need space to regroup. I took almost a year off after college, just traveled around and sketched everything I saw. My parents thought I was having some kind of crisis, but it turned out to be exactly what I needed. Emma felt a rush of gratitude for his easy acceptance. No probing questions, no judgment, just simple understanding that life sometimes required pauses. They talked for another 20 minutes about books, about the neighborhood, about the strange comfort of coffee shop routines. David was an easy conversationalist, able to fill silences without making Emma feel pressured to contribute more than she was comfortable sharing. When he mentioned that he lived just a few blocks away and had been looking for a good place to work outside his apartment, Emma felt a flutter of possibility. This place is perfect for that, she said. Quiet enough to concentrate, but not so quiet that you feel like you're disturbing everyone if you shift in your chair. Exactly. I think I've found my new office away from home. David finished his coffee and began gathering his things. I hope you don't mind sharing the space. I don't mind at all, Emma said, and she meant it. As David stood to leave, he paused. I hope this isn't too forward, but would you like to see the sketch I made yesterday? I mean, you were part of the atmosphere I was trying to capture. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The idea of being noticed enough to be included in someone's art was both thrilling and terrifying. I'd like that, she said quietly. David reached into his messenger bag and pulled out his sketchbook, flipping through several pages before finding what he was looking for. He turned the book toward Emma, and she felt her heart stop. The drawing was beautiful, capturing not just the physical space of the coffee shop, but something more intangible. The way sunlight created patterns on the floor, the relaxed posture of people absorbed in their own activities, the sense of peaceful coexistence that made the place feel safe. And there, in the corner, was a figure that was unmistakably her, though rendered with such gentle care that she looked more serene than she felt. That's how you see me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. That's how you looked, David replied. Completely absorbed in your own world, but somehow still connected to everything around you. It was beautiful. Emma stared at the drawing, seeing herself through someone else's eyes for the first time in months. In David's sketch, she didn't look broken or lost. She looked contemplative, peaceful, like someone worth including in a picture of beauty and tranquility. Thank you for showing me this, she managed. Thank you for letting me share your table today, David replied. I hope I'll see you tomorrow. Emma nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. After David left, Emma sat in the coffee shop for another hour, thinking about the conversation and the sketch. She thought about how it felt to be seen not as a collection of problems to be solved or symptoms to be managed, but as a person worthy of artistic attention. For the first time since her breakdown, she began to imagine a future that might include more than just survival. That evening, Emma called her sister Rachel. You sound different, Rachel said immediately. Better. What's changed? Emma hesitated, then told her about David, about their conversation, about the sketch. Emma, that's wonderful. Rachel's excitement was palpable through the phone. You talked to someone new? Someone who doesn't know about everything you've been through. That's huge progress. I'm scared, Rachel, Emma admitted. What if I'm not ready for this? What if I let him get close and then he sees how broken I am? What if you let him get close and he sees how strong you are? Rachel countered gently. What if he sees someone who's been through hell and is finding her way back? That's not broken, Emma. That's human. Emma thought about David's sketch, about the way he'd captured her in a moment of peace rather than pain. Maybe Rachel was right. Maybe there was more to her than the scars and the sadness. Maybe she was finally ready to find out. Over the next 3 weeks, Emma and David fell into an easy routine. They would arrive at the coffee shop around the same time each afternoon, sometimes sharing a table, sometimes sitting separately but acknowledging each other with smiles and small waves. Their conversations grew longer and more comfortable, touching on everything from books and art to their favorite places in the city. Emma learned that David had moved to town 6 months ago for a new job with a small design firm that specialized in creating materials for nonprofit organizations. He'd left behind a life in Chicago that had become too small for him, though he was vague about the specifics. She appreciated that he didn't press her for details about her own circumstances, seeming to understand that some stories needed time to unfold. "I've been thinking about your Alice Munro comment," David said one afternoon as they shared a plate of the coffee shop's surprisingly good lemon bars. "About needing stories that don't demand too much emotionally. I wonder if that's why I like sketching people in public places. There's story there, but it's not my story to carry." Emma considered this, thinking about how exhausting it had been when every book, every movie, every piece of media seemed to reflect her own pain back at her. Yes, exactly. Sometimes you need to step outside your own experience without having to take on someone else's trauma. It's like emotional Switzerland. David laughed, and the sound made Emma's chest warm. She was getting used to making him laugh, to the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when she said something that amused him. It was addictive, this feeling of being someone who could bring joy to another person. "I'm stealing that phrase," he said. "Emotional Switzerland. That's perfect." Their friendship, if that's what this was, felt safe in a way Emma hadn't expected. David never pushed her boundaries, never asked personal questions that felt intrusive, never made her feel like she had to be anyone other than exactly who she was in that moment. When she was quiet, he was comfortable with silence. When she wanted to talk, he listened with genuine attention. But Emma was becoming aware of something else growing alongside their easy companionship, an attraction that she wasn't sure she was ready to acknowledge. She found herself noticing the way David's hands moved when he spoke, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way he always smelled faintly of coffee, and something she couldn't identify, but that made her want to lean closer. These observations both thrilled and terrified her. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday afternoon when Emma arrived at the coffee shop to find David already there, hunched over his sketchbook with an expression of intense frustration. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, his hair damp from the rain, and there was a tension in his shoulders that Emma had never seen before. "Rough day?" she asked gently as she approached his table. David looked up, and Emma was startled to see genuine distress in his eyes. "Sorry, I'm not very good company today. Work stuff." Creative differences with a client that turned into something bigger. Emma hesitated for a moment, then made a decision. "Would you like to talk about it? Sometimes it helps to tell someone who's not involved." David studied her face as if trying to determine whether she really wanted to know or was just being polite. Whatever he saw there seemed to reassure him. "Are you sure? It's not exactly uplifting conversation." "I'm sure," Emma said, settling into the chair across from him. "I'm tougher than I look." Something in her tone must have convinced him because David closed his sketchbook and leaned back in his chair. "The client is a women's shelter. They want us to design their annual fundraising materials, but they have very specific ideas about how the women they serve should be portrayed. They want images that are—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Sanitized. Hopeful. Nothing that might make donors uncomfortable." Emma felt her stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" "They don't want any visible signs of trauma. No bruises, no fearful expressions, nothing that might suggest these women have actually been through hell. They want them to look grateful and recovered, as if a few weeks in a shelter erases years of abuse." David's voice carried an anger that Emma recognized, the fury of someone who understood that healing wasn't linear or simple. "That's horrible," Emma said quietly. Those women deserve to have their real experiences acknowledged, not glossed over for the comfort of people who've never lived through anything like that. David's expression shifted, and Emma realized she'd revealed more about herself than she'd intended. But instead of the pity or curiosity she expected to see, his face showed only understanding and something that looked like respect. Exactly, he said. I tried to explain that authentic representation would actually be more powerful, that people respond to truth even when it's difficult. But they were adamant. They said they knew their donors, knew what would get people to open their wallets. Emma thought about her own experience, about how isolating it had been to see trauma portrayed in media as something that could be overcome with enough determination and the right support system. The reality was messy, more complicated, full of setbacks and small victories, and days when getting dressed felt like a monumental achievement. What will you do? She asked. David sighed. I don't know. I need the work. But I'm not sure I can create something that misrepresents these women's experiences just to make donors feel better about themselves. Emma felt something shift inside her, a familiar urge to help, to advocate, that she hadn't felt since before her breakdown. What if there was a middle ground? A way to show strength without hiding struggle? David leaned forward, interested. What do you mean? Emma found herself thinking about the sketch he'd made of her weeks ago, how he'd captured her in a moment of peace without erasing the underlying sadness. You have this ability to see people as they really are, but also to find the beauty in that reality. What if you could show these women as survivors without pretending they haven't survived something terrible? Go on, David encouraged. I don't know much about design, but what if the focus was on resilience rather than recovery? Show them as they are, maybe tired, maybe still healing, but strong, real. Let people see that these women are worthy of support exactly as they are, not just as success stories. David was quiet for a long moment, and Emma worried she'd overstepped. This was his work, his expertise, and she was just someone with too many opinions about trauma representation. That's brilliant, he said finally. You're absolutely right. Resilience isn't about erasing what you've been through. It's about continuing to exist despite it. The conversation continued for another hour, with Emma finding herself more engaged and passionate than she'd been in months. She told David about her background in social work, about how frustrated she'd become with systems that prioritized funding over authentic support for the people they claimed to serve. She didn't mention her own breakdown, but she spoke with the authority of someone who understood trauma from multiple perspectives. When they finally parted ways that evening, David looked energized in a way that made Emma feel useful for the first time in months. But more than that, she realized that something had changed in how he looked at her. The polite interest of new friendship had deepened into something more complex, more intimate. He was beginning to see her not just as a pleasant coffee shop companion, but as someone with depth, insight, and strength. That night, Emma lay in bed replaying their conversation, surprised by how natural it had felt to slip back into her old role as advocate and advisor. Dr. Martinez had often talked about how healing happened in layers, how you could regain different aspects of yourself at different stages of recovery. Maybe today marked the return of Emma the helper, Emma the one who stood up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. But with this realization came fear. David was starting to see more of who she really was, which meant it was only a matter of time before he began asking questions she wasn't ready to answer. How long could she maintain this facade of being someone who was simply between jobs, rather than someone who had fallen apart so completely that basic functioning had become impossible? The next afternoon, Emma arrived at the coffee shop to find David already there, working with renewed energy. When he saw her, his face lit up with excitement. I spent all night reworking the concept, he said, pushing his sketchbook across the table toward her. I want to show you what you inspired. Emma looked down at the sketches and felt her breath catch. David had drawn a series of portraits, women of different ages and backgrounds, each showing signs of what they'd endured, but each also radiating an unmistakable strength. There were tired eyes that still held determination, hands that bore scars but were reaching toward something better, faces that showed pain but refused to surrender to it. They're beautiful, Emma whispered, and she meant it. These women looked real, human, worthy of respect, and support exactly as they were. The client is going to hate them, David said, but he was grinning. But I think you're right. I think people will respond to this honesty. And if they don't, then maybe they're not the kind of donors these women need anyway. Emma looked up from the sketches to find David watching her intently. Thank you, he said quietly, for listening yesterday, for understanding what I was trying to do, for helping me find a way forward. I haven't had anyone to talk through work stuff with since I moved here. Thank you for trusting me with it, Emma replied. It felt good to be useful again. There was something in the air between them, a charge that Emma couldn't ignore. David's eyes had dropped to her lips, and she felt her heart rate quicken. This was the moment when their friendship would either evolve into something more or when Emma would need to find an excuse to pull away before she got in too deep. David seemed to make a decision. He reached across the table and gently covered her hand with his. Emma's first instinct was to pull away. He was touching her wrist, close to where the scars were hidden beneath her sleeve. But his touch was so gentle, so careful, that she forced herself to stay still. Emma, he said softly, I hope you know how much I've come to value our friendship. These weeks of getting to know you have been the best part of moving to a new city. Emma's throat felt tight with emotion. David, I don't want to push you, he continued, but I'd like to spend more time with you outside of this coffee shop. Maybe we could have dinner sometime, or I could show you some of the places I've discovered since moving here. Emma looked down at their joined hands, at the way his thumb was unconsciously stroking across her knuckles. She wanted to say yes more than she'd wanted anything in months. But the weight of everything he didn't know about her felt crushing. I'd like that, she heard herself say. But there are things about me, about my life, that you don't know. Things that might change how you feel about spending time with me. David's expression grew serious, but he didn't release her hand. Emma, we all have things in our past that we're not proud of, experiences that have shaped us in ways we're still figuring out. Whatever you're carrying, it doesn't change who you are right now, in this moment. Emma felt tears threaten and blinked them back. You might feel differently if you knew the specifics. Try me, David said gently. Emma took a shaky breath. This was the moment of truth, the moment when she either trusted David with her reality or lost him to her fear. She thought about the women in his sketches, about the strength he'd seen in survival, about the possibility that maybe she was ready to be seen completely. Okay, she said quietly. But not here. This conversation deserves more privacy than a coffee shop can provide. David squeezed her hand gently. My apartment is just a few blocks away, if you're comfortable with that. Or we could walk in the park, find a quiet bench. Emma considered her options, thinking about where she would feel safest having the most difficult conversation of her life. Your apartment sounds good, she decided. But, David, once I tell you everything, you might understand why I said I might not be worthy of the kind of friendship you're offering. David stood, still holding her hand, and looked directly into her eyes. Emma, I can't imagine anything that would make me think less of you. But, even if I could, you deserve to be known for who you are, not who you think you should be. As they walked toward David's apartment, Emma felt terrified and hopeful in equal measure. She was about to trust someone with her truth, all of it, and she had no idea whether he would stay or run. But, for the first time since her breakdown, she was ready to find out. David's apartment was exactly what Emma had imagined, filled with natural light, walls covered with his artwork, and a lived-in comfort that spoke of someone who had created a true home for himself. Books were stacked on every available surface, plants thrived in the large windows, and there was a sense of creative energy in every corner. It felt like a safe space, which Emma hoped would make the conversation ahead easier. Can I make you some tea? David offered, clearly sensing her nervousness. I have this chamomile blend that's supposed to be calming, though I'm not sure if that's just marketing. Emma nodded gratefully, settling onto his couch and trying to figure out where to begin. She watched David move around his small,